Hey guys, welcome to a weekly story time. If you like these story times, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already, leave a comment. All those things really do help out the channel here on YouTube. And if you want to support what we're doing, get bonus content, the best way to do that is over on Patreon. A link to our Patreon is down below. So in this week's story time, I want to talk about my mindset going into punishment. So often these story times, I focus on the circumstances of punishment, what happened, kind of the process of our punishment. And I feel like I've never really talked about my mindset going into punishment. And that really is super important. I know that if you don't have the right mindset going into punishment, it's number one going to make your punishment really, really difficult. It's going to maybe cause some resentment or just some anger to build. It's going to create negative emotional responses within you. And it might even negate the benefits of going through punishment in the first place. And so you really, I can't really say enough about making sure that your mindset is right when you go into punishment. So I'm going to talk through my process, how I kind of make sure that my mindset is in a right space for receiving punishment, and how that has really helped develop success within our punishment system. So when we go through punishments, it is really important to make sure that we understand and accept responsibility. I have never met a taken in hand that is punished without knowing why. Typically, these are rules that have been established, and we are very well aware of the rule, the expectation, the consequence. Very, very rarely have I ever heard of someone say that they were punished and they had absolutely no idea why that happened. And so when we go into punishment, we know why. We know what we did. We know how we broke a rule, and we know what the consequence was, even if we're unhappy about it, even if we maybe have an attitude about it where it's like, I just don't think this rule should exist, or I just didn't want to follow this rule. You knew the rule existed though, still. So again, accepting responsibility, that is the first step. For me, even if I'm having a hard time kind of accepting responsibility and accepting the necessity of punishment, I will start earlier in that day, and I will start to think through what I did. And sometimes I talk to a friend, and that's really helpful, because if I'm really in that self-righteous indignation of feeling justified in my misbehavior, then talking to a friend can really help me see the error of my ways, because I have a really good friend that will call me out when I am just too much in my feelings. And so that really does help. But I try to do that for myself as well, where I think through the situation and I think through and I'm like, okay, even if I had a good reason, even if I feel justified in my misbehavior, I still broke the standard, I still broke the rule, and there really is no excuse for that. And so that is the first step, is really thinking through and coming to terms with your responsibility in the situation, and coming to terms with the necessity of punishment, and how the consequence does make sense because you agreed to it and because that was what you knew would happen. The second step is really right before punishment. Now, some couples use corner time code and I do not. If you find that corner time is a really good way to reflect and think through and kind of create the proper mindset, good. That's fantastic. I have nothing against corner time if it is actually beneficial. But what Coda and I were finding was corner time just did not do anything for me. It did not help me reflect. It did not help me, set my mind right. But what does help me is he will have me write out an apology. What this forces me to do is to rethink through what happened, why my behavior was wrong, and apologize for it. What I don't do in my apologies is I do not try to justify my actions. I do not try to explain away why my misbehavior wasn't as bad as it actually was. What I do in my apologies is I acknowledge what I did, how it broke the rules, how it caused stress or strife or tension in our relationship. And I acknowledge that I understand that the punishment is earned, well deserved, and necessary. And I do apologize for what I did. I mean, it's an apology, so that is kind of implied, but important to note that I go through all of those steps. I say what I did, how I understand it was wrong, I apologize, and I also talk through what I will do next time to avoid going down that road again and having that same misbehavior. This is really, really helpful. I take about 20 minutes before my punishment to really think through and acknowledge all of those things. And all of that really does help. It helps put my mind into a place where I can really accept the punishment and I can accept the consequences. So by the time that I am done, Coda will have me bring my apology to him as soon as I'm finished. He will read through it. He will make his lecture points. That also makes it easier for him to lecture me, because if he was going to really emphasize some points, but he sees in my apology that I've already acknowledged all of that, then he can make his lecture more direct and shorter, which is really helpful for us too. And I was going to say that this is something that is extremely helpful to me as well, is when Coda lectures me in a very direct and very stern manner. That really does help me accept my punishment, and it helps me just kind of go into punishment with a sense of yielding in how I approach that process. I think it's really important to not go into punishment feeling justified, because when you feel justified, even if you get into position, even if you are physically submitting yourself to the process, mentally you're not submitting to the process, and it makes it so much harder. And so you need to submit your whole self to the process of punishment, submit your whole self to your head of household. And when you can do that, not only physically in the act of getting into position and taking the spanking, but when you can submit yourself emotionally to the process, that is when you get the best results. And that's also, it makes it easier, in my opinion, to stay in position, to, kind of let your guard down, become more vulnerable when you submit your whole self to the process. And so that is really how I go into punishment, is I really understand my actions and my behavior and my responsibility. I take ownership over those things. I don't try to explain them away. I don't try to justify them. I don't try to push responsibility off onto anyone else. Now, there are times where there are extenuating circumstances, and I will ask Coda to consider those and keep those in perspective when he's deciding how to address the misbehavior. However, that is his decision, and I have to be willing to submit myself to the decision that he made, even if his decision, and more often than not, this has been the case when he's decided to do a correction instead of a punishment because of circumstances. And if I'm expecting a punishment, I have to be willing to accept a correction. And vice versa. If I think that he should give a correction because of the circumstances, but he decides to go ahead and follow through with punishment, I need to be willing to accept that as well. And so really just putting myself in a position to accept his authority, to accept his decision, and putting myself into a mind frame to accept responsibility for what I did regardless. And that is how I have successful outcomes. That's how I can, put myself into position. That's how I can, stay in position as I am receiving the very intense and very painful spanking that is earned and well deserved in those circumstances. It's still physically difficult to accept a spanking, even if you've earned it, especially when it is very, very intense. But if you go into it with the right mind frame, it becomes easier to accept that spanking, to accept that sensation, to understand the purpose behind the punishment, to understand the necessity of the punishment, and to really make yourself vulnerable and to understand that you have no justification for your misbehavior, for what you did, and you need the punishment in order to be forgiven, in order to move forward in your relationship, in order to put that mistake in the past and wipe the slate clean, completely rectify the mistake in your relationship so that you can move forward with a renewed sense of commitment to your role and to fulfilling your duties and your responsibilities. And so that is why mindset's so important. That's why I really try to go in, and I would say at this point, 9 times out of 10, I am going into punishment with a complete sense of yielding. And I really do focus on accepting responsibility. Now, it is still difficult to physically yield myself to the process from the standpoint that when the spanking first starts, it is so intense and my body tenses, and I have to kind of like in my mind remind myself that like I I put myself in this position. Now I need to accept the consequences. I need to um, yield myself to this process, and I need to feel this. I need to go through this so that we can get past this mistake. And I kind of talk myself through it internally, and I try to force my body to kind of relax into the process so that I'm not physically tensing, so that I'm not creating any type of body language that communicates resistance. And that all comes from that mindset of knowing that I deserve this, knowing that I need to go through this process, and knowing the purpose behind the punishment and my responsibility in the situation, and understanding that punishment is not something that my head of household is doing to me. It's something that he's doing for me because that is within his role to offer and hold accountability. And it is within his role to step in and guide me with those boundaries and give those consequences when they are deserved and when they are earned. And that is completely like when a consequence is deserved is completely up to me and how I behave. And so if I don't want the consequences, then I need to choose to behave appropriately. And that is, my head of household is not stepping in and giving me consequences for things that I didn't do. And so understanding that that is on me. Those are my actions and my behavior that caused the consequences. It's not something that I need to look at him and say like, how dare you do this to me? He's not doing it to me. He's doing it for me because that is what he agreed to do within our relationship. And it's something that if I wanted to avoid the consequences, then I needed to avoid the behavior. And understanding that really does help my mindset in accepting responsibility as well. Unless I accept responsibility and unless I accept the consequences, I am not going to get what I need out of punishment. My attitude is going to be completely terrible, and Koda will not allow that to happen. If I come out of punishment with a bad attitude, Koda will either correct me or he will punish me again, because that's just not acceptable. And I know that that's not acceptable. That's a standard that we've discussed in our relationship. And I would say that if that is something that you haven't discussed, think about it. Like, what is the likely outcome if you come out of punishment with a bad attitude and that's not something that would be corrected further and you're allowed to maintain that attitude? That's just going to break down your relationship. That's going to lead to disrespect or disobedience or, just strife, maybe an argument. That's going to lead to things that should not be happening in your relationship, which is why CODA goes ahead and punishes the attitude right away so that it doesn't cause breakdown in our relationship by allowing that attitude to fester and grow. And so, if that's not something that you've talked about, maybe consider it. But that's kind of the story of how I try to approach punishment, my mindset going into punishment, and how I work through that process in order to have good outcomes from our punishments. So, anyway, guys, thanks for joining me, and we will talk to you next time.